Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you how to create a traveler's notebook. If you've never created a traveler's notebook before, it's actually a fairly simple process and doesn't require a lot of materials. So let's get started. So let's talk about traveler's notebooks. The traveler's notebooks come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. They actually come in from this is what would be considered a more regular size traveler's notebook. You can have really small ones, there's really large ones. I think when I was looking online, there's maybe about 10 common sizes, and then I also make books and covers of my own, so I kind of make them in whatever size that I like to use them in. If you'd like to learn more about how you can use a traveler's notebook in your own creative practice, I have a video that I have the card in the right hand corner there that you can also view to give you some ideas and inspiration on how you can use it in your own creative practice. So the first thing we want to talk about is what paper we're using for our traveler's notebooks. There's really the outer cover paper and then the interior paper. My outer cover is actually made with scrapbooking paper. I like that it's double-sided, so it has a nice design both on the inside and on the outside. You can really use any sort of paper for this. I've seen ones where people have laminated them. I've seen ones where really you can use almost anything for your outside of your traveler's notebook. I love using just a nice scrapbooking paper because it's strong, it's sturdy, and it isn't really expensive. The other thing I like to use is a copy paper. It's 32 pound. It's super smooth. So what's nice about this is when I'm using my fountain pens and I'm using markers and other writing utensils on it, it's very smooth. It doesn't seep through the paper, and it also doesn't muck up my pen nibs, which is really important for me. I don't like damaging my nibs on my fountain pens with scratchy paper. So that's a personal preference. Really, you can just use copy paper or any sort of paper you have on hand. So for this particular traveler's notebook, because I'm going to be doing one this size, this is considered a more regular traveler's notebook size, and this is probably a size you'll have an easier time finding a cover for if you're choosing to buy a cover separately. So for this project, I had decided to use the Wild Whisper Designs. It's one of their pandemic collections. It actually has like this toilet paper pattern on it, and I absolutely love it. So I've already cut this one to 8 1/4 by 8 5/8. So the idea with the traveler's notebook is you want to look at the height of it, which is 8 1/4, and then you actually want to, if you were opening a book, you would want to consider what's the full fold of the book. So that's where the 8 5/8 come in. So that actually creates you a book that's 8 1/4 inches high by 4.33 inches across for each individual page. And so for this one, I've already pre-cut it from a 12 by 12 piece of scrapbooking paper, and it's for one of my pandemic traveler's notebooks. So for this one, to actually get this to 8 1/4, we basically take a 1/4 inch off of the one side, we turn it, and we cut to 8 5/8 on the other side. And keep these little pieces. These little pieces, I'm going to show you how to turn them into a really small book afterwards, and this is what you can use your offcuts for. Is you don't necessarily have to do a big traveler's notebook, but you don't necessarily need to just throw out all the little pieces that you have. And what you want to do with this is you actually want to cut 5 of these. You want to cut 5 inner sheets and just 1 outer sheet. And you want to cut them to those dimensions of 8 1/4 by 8 5/8. And then once we do that, we'll move on to the second step, which is folding the paper. So one thing you want to be aware of when you're folding the paper, especially with a regular traveler's notebook, is both dimensions are fairly close together. So you want to definitely keep an eye out and make sure you're folding it in the right direction. So 8 1/4 is what we want our height to be. So we're going to want to actually fold it this way, which is the 8 5/8. And so to do this, all you need to do is basically fold your paper in half and run your finger down it. If you want a better score line, what you can do is take a bone folder. I have 2 bone folders here. This is a bone folder I used to use a lot, but I'm not sure if you can see it on camera, but it has all these scratches and marks. And one thing I've realized is because I do make a lot of books, I actually have damaged my bone folder. So this one probably needs to be replaced. So in the meantime, I've been actually using this one that I have that has a metal edge. And so that's basically your fold on that one. And then the same thing for each of your individual sheets. So this is the 8 5/8. So we want to actually fold it this way because we want to make sure that this is 8 1/4 before we fold, because once you fold them, you really need to grab a new piece of paper and redo it if you choose the wrong direction. So something to be very aware of when you're working on this. And you actually want to cut and fold all 5 pieces of your paper. So once you have all 5 of your pieces of your paper folded, as well as your outer bit folded, one thing you may want to do is put these together as one book. So basically what we're creating is what's called a signature. A signature is basically pieces of folded paper that are adhered together to make what's called a signature. So a book might have 10 or 15 or 20 signatures depending on how the book is built. I spoke about this more in my tutorial about how I use a traveler's notebook in my work. So once you have your signature, the next thing you want to do is adhere it together some way. Most people just use a stapler and just staple these in a couple of places and call it done. It's not a bad way of doing things, but for these larger books, I prefer using a hand-stitched binding. So when it comes to hand-stitched binding, one thing you need to be aware of is, in this case, we're going to do a 5-hole binding. So what you need to do is actually pierce your paper in 5 places, and then we'll be running a thread through it to secure it. In this case, what I've done is I've actually cut a piece of paper that's the same width, so 8 1/4 inches, and I have actually marked it in 5 spaces. I took 8 1/4 inches and I divided it in 2, so it'd be 4 1/8. So that was my first mark. Then I figured out from there what would be the difference to be able to have these 2 marks. So really I have marks at 1 1/8 inches, 2 5/8 inches, 4 1/8 inches, 5 5/8 inches, and 7 1/8 inches. And if you actually want to refer to this at any point, I do have my website where I actually do have an article on this with all the measurements as well, just so that you have something you can come back and reference if you need to in the future. So when you're doing this, you actually do want to use a cutting mat, or you don't want to be doing this right on your silicone mat. It's probably going to cause some problems. So what I'm going to do is, there's 2 different ways you can do this. You can do this with a couple different things. A needle, like a really strong needle, an awl, which basically just poke through the paper, or you can use a screw punch. I moved to the screw punch to make things easier, and just it's a little bit more convenient for me. So just to show you what the difference is. So I basically line these up, and I'm taking the screw punch and then pushing down quite hard. And that's going to go through both pieces of paper. You want to line up again, and you want to try to get as close to that center line as possible. And you want to make sure that your piece of paper here is within the fold of the paper. It's going to make stitching a whole lot easier. And you just press down, and that's how a screw punch works to help you get through that paper. And I didn't press down hard enough. So let's try it again. So I can see my marks. And I'm doing 2 pieces of paper at a time while I'm doing this. So there you can see you have your nice holes in there, and you want to do that with the remaining pieces of paper. If you're using an awl, one thing I like to use is I like having something soft in behind my awl that it can pierce into. It makes this a little bit easier and a little bit more stable. So using an awl or a needle, basically you just pierce through. Since my little mat isn't very big, I'll move it. The awl works quite well, but the one thing it does is it does kind of pierce through and leave these little tags of paper. The one thing about the screw punch is it basically punches an actual hole in the paper, like a tiny little hole punch, so you have a much cleaner look and you don't have any paper coming along the back. So it's something to think about when you're doing this. I didn't invest into a screw punch until I had been doing this for a while. I found it was just much easier for what I was doing, but if you're only making a book every once in a while, use an awl or use a needle just to make your life easier. And so I'm going to do the rest of these sheets right now, and then we'll move on to the next step. One thing to think about is when you're actually putting a book together is you need to think about what use you're using it for, and that will depend on how many pieces of paper you put into your traveler's notebook. I have actually done ones with 10 sheets, which are great for just writing, but I find for doing art journaling or putting a lot of pictures in them, they're not the best option. So it's something to think about how thick you want your book to get and how you really want to use it, and that will dictate how many pieces of paper you put into your traveler's notebook. So to create your signature, you're basically just adding your 5 pieces of paper together with your outer cover, and again you have all your nice holes in there that we're now going to start stitching. So what I like using is embroidery floss for this. I just happen to have a lot of it around. I used to cross stitch years and years and years ago, and I have so much of it I thought, well, why not use it in my books? So in this case, this is a very light color, so I'm going to maybe stick with this actually I'm going to stick with white with this one. And in this case I'm just taking a piece of it, so what you want to do is take your embroidery floss and just thread your needle. I prefer using a needle with a blunt edge. It works a little bit better for me. So once you thread your needle, the next thing we want to do is do stitching. And I learned this particular pattern from an article on Design Sponge. And so I can't say that this is something I came up with on my own. So we're going to count our holes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so we can try to keep this straight. So you want to start with the book open, with the cover on the outside. And with the book open, you want to go through hole 3, which is the center hole. You want to go from the outside of hole 4 in. Then you want to go to hole 5. And then you want to go back through hole 4. Sometimes you need to flip your book to see what you're doing. Then you want to go across to hole 2. You just make sure my tail is on one side. You go up through hole 1 from the outside to the inside. You go back down through hole 2. And then up through hole 3. And with hole 3, what I try to do is I try to have one tail on one side and one tail on the other. And then what this allows me to do is allows me to tie a knot. And I usually like to double knot it because I like making it nice and tight. And because this thread is not very heavy, it still looks really nice with that like that. And so then you basically just cut your ends. And there you go. So on the outside, you have like this really nice stitch with embroidery floss. And you can have these contrasting to your book. They can blend in with your book, really any color you want to have. And then it has this nice little binding on the inside. And then at every page, it actually holds it really nicely in place. And I've just found that this particular binding has been one of my favorites to use with book binding. So before we go decorate our cover, the one thing we want to do is look at cleaning up the edges. You'll notice that with the traveler's notebooks that every time you put another piece of paper in, this line here of where your paper actually folds, because every time you fold it, it folds a little bit further out than before. And what you want to do is you want to clean up that line so that it does match the rest of the cover. So all you need to do is put your steel rule. You want something with a steel edge because this is going to probably protect your fingers and prevent you from cutting yourself. And I'm grabbing an X-Acto knife, a box cutter. You could really use an X-Acto knife or anything else for this. You want to use a cutting mat for this. And as you can see, by just removing those pieces, we're going to end up with a really nice edge on our book. There you go. So now you have a nice smooth edge on your book. And if you have little bits like this, all you need to do is take your steel rule again and just go along that line and clean up any of those little edges that you don't want. So at this point, you could just really leave this as is, add it to a traveler's notebook cover, and call it done. But what I like to do is actually sometimes decorate the fronts. If you're going to decorate the fronts before you finish your book, I would say do not add too many bulky items on top, because you're going to have issues when you're trying to stamp or write or anything on the inside pages that are on the left-hand side. So don't do anything too chunky. You can always do that at the end after you finish your book if you feel like it. But in this case, I'm going to use some paper embellishments that are going to be fairly flat, so they'll work quite well for this. So for this, I'm going to be using the 6 Feet Apart collection that Well Whisper did for the pandemic. And if you're interested in this particular collection, definitely use my code DTNadine at checkout to get 10% off of your next purchase. But it's really great imagery, and I think it works perfectly for this time of pandemic. And I know the pandemic isn't over, and I know a lot of us are tired of talking about it, but I want to still continue to talk about and record the things I'm experiencing through this time. So I thought I would create another traveler's notebook to continue talking about my journey through COVID. I have a few things I wanted to use. I love all this imagery of like staying home, staying safe, frontline workers, flatten the curve, all of these things that have become part of our language during the pandemic. I love the idea of the 6 feet apart. I love the idea that everything we do right now seems to be on a computer or on Zoom. Even my work, a lot of times I'm actually working from home while I'm also working on this website. I like this imagery, but I want to have another layer back there. So I think I'm going to use this lovely striped paper and do another section of paper. Not the whole size but of the traveler's notebook, but just a small subsection that I'm going to use on the front cover. So I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to say 3.5 by maybe 6. And then from there, I'll cut it down to size. I'll see if I can make that as another layer in here. So Well Whisper Designs also has a bunch of these tags that have imagery on either side of them. And this is one of the ones that I am using. It came from this piece of paper, which actually is where I found the laptop image, was from here. Actually, other side, sorry. The laptop image was from here, and so I still had COVID-19 on the back, so I thought I would take that and turn it into another layer. Again, you don't have to leave these embellishments and these elements just as they are. You can play with them. Add a little bit of your own feel to how you want things to be. In this case, I like the 6 feet apart. I don't want to leave that imagery out, so I'm going to do something like this. I'm probably actually going to cut the 6 feet apart. It's not all going to go all the way to the bottom. I'm just going to cut this bottom edge here so that that's going to look a little bit more interesting. So I like that shadow and I don't want to lose it. And I'm purposely cutting and leaving some of that shadow. There we go. I love how this collection works so well together, so all your elements look like they're meant to be there. I don't want this touching the top. I still want to have a bit of a border. I'm going to push this a little bit to the left. So I also want to add a couple more images in there. There's this really great paper that has COVID-19 on one side and it has all of these little hand sanitizer, hand soap items on the other. And I think what I'm going to do is actually cut out some of these and add them to my layout. So I've kind of come up with the embellishments that I want to use on this page. The one thing is I like the screen, but I want to add some lettering to it. So maybe a little bit ironic, but I took my vintage typewriter to fill in the words for my electronic computer embellishment. I really like the idea of 2021, the pandemic continues on, because it definitely hasn't come to an end. But because this paper is just copy paper and this is a lot more brighter, what I'm going to do is actually cut out this square here and just adhere this in the background. So I'm going to grab my cutting mat again. This time I'm using my X-Acto knife and I'm just going to basically cut out the inside of this image. And I hope you like this idea of using a traveler's notebook to record your thoughts of the day. And what's nice about the traveler's notebook is sometimes you buy really nice notebooks, or at least I do, and I go, oh, I have to use it for something really special. And there's something about when you're using copy paper, or even just nice super smooth paper like I am, some scrapbooking paper, and putting something together yourself, I find them a lot more I'm a lot less nervous about using it for some of my projects. So this is just a great way of writing down a lot of your thoughts and feelings during these times and just recording those moments in your life. And so now I'm going to do something like this. I think I like the spacing of that one a little bit better. The easiest way to get this down is just adding dots along the edges, adhere it down, and then cut the paper around it. That way, for sure, you're sure that your image is square and that it's going to stay in place, because you want to make sure that lettering is really straight. And if you cut it first, you may not end up with straight lettering, and you may not be really happy with the final result. So yeah, I'm just taking some thermal web dots and just putting them down on my image. Square it up and cut it out. So there's my little computer with the 2021 The Pandemic Continues On, and I think it adds a little bit more dimension now, because you can definitely tell that the paper in behind has been kind of taped on, and that makes it almost feel like there's two layers going on there, because there is. And a lot of these embellishments were actually just from the paper. This was from a card that came with the 6 Feet Apart collection. This was from the paper that I had shown you earlier. So there's lots of ways you can create embellishments when you have these really graphical papers that you're working with. So I'm just going to go ahead and just paste this all down and meet you on the other side. So now I've added all my embellishments on the top, and as you can see, it's basically just layering things. But again, it's not going to be too thick. When you turn the pages and you want to write, it's not going to affect your writing. This is basically how you can do a nice cover on your traveler's notebook, so you know exactly which one it is. And the one thing I wanted to finish up with was to show you what you can do with those little extra pieces of paper. As you remember, we basically cut these off to get that dimension that we needed for our traveler's notebook. And basically what I did was take a look at what we had left for dimension. 2 3/8. So I basically made a book 2 3/8 by 2 3/8, and basically folded the paper in half again. Added a little cover of a piece of paper that I had laying around. And with these ones, I wouldn't take the time to sew them. They're going to be very hard to sew. So what I would do is basically take the book. You could probably get away with just one staple, but I'm going to add 2. And what you want to do is just staple them so that the nice staple's on the outside and that the rough staple's on the inside. And this is part of the reason I like sewing them over stapling them in general, is I don't like having that kind of rough finish on the inside. But for a little one like this, that you might want to just use for putting notes in or something, it works quite well. And as you can see, the staples are there. They are in place, so they shouldn't cause any issues. But yeah, you can use this as a little notebook, write down some ideas, some quotes, anything. I have all sorts of different sizes for uses like this. I hope you've really enjoyed what we've done here today, and I hope this is giving you some inspiration to try actually creating your own books. I know for myself, when I started creating notebooks, it kind of opened things up for me, and then I started getting into different ways you could bind things. And so for me, it's been I've actually moved more towards making my own books than buying books in the last little while. And so for next week, I'm going to be talking about different ways we can use stamping in our projects, some of the tips, tricks, and techniques that I use in my own work that I hope will be helpful to you. If you don't want to miss out on any of that, just hit the little notification button and subscribe so you'll be updated when my next video comes out. I hope they have a really great week, and you can always check hopalongstudio.com for other ideas on how to have a creative self-care habit in your own life. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.